The Bedrock. All of Prince Edward Island is underlain by red beds, sandstone, and siltstone, with some conglomerate and some shale. These rocks were at one time sand, silt, gravel, and mud, respectively. They seem to have accumulated in estuaries and on shallow marine benches at a period of time which is placed at about 250 million years ago, and called the Permo-Carboniferous. Since that remote time, the area has lain undisturbed as a lowland. Deep beneath the red rocks, which we nowadays find on the surface of the island, there is evidence of other events which are even older than 250 million years. A few years ago, very deep holes were drilled in Charlottetown Harbor and at a couple of other places. These holes went through a thickness of 10,000 feet of the red beds we have just described into another set of rocks. The deeply buried rocks show that ancient seas, which were once spread over the area, had partly dried up in some places to make beds of gypsum and salt. The information from the drilling further shows that these old rocks were folded and broken before the younger red beds were spread over them. Although we have no direct record, we know that still older events are recorded beneath our feet. Thus, thousands and thousands of feet below us, there lies an enormous thickness of rocks that record a story of the Earth's history from its very beginning, 4 to 5 billion years ago. But let's go back to the surface for another look at the red rocks there and see how they are important in the national park. In the park itself, we see very little of the rocky framework of Prince Edward Island. It does stick out, however, between Rustico and Cavendish, where it forms the coastline for a few miles. Here we can walk over the rocks and see what they consist of. What the rocks are made of. The first thing we may note about the rocks is that they are composed mostly of small grains of sand, coated with a thin layer of reddish iron oxide. These sand grains are set in a matrix of even finer particles of silt and mud, bits and pieces of white mica, and grayish clay material. The sandstones are sedimentary rocks, and any sedimentary rock is really a monument to the destruction of some other rocks somewhere else, for the grains of sand you see here have come from the tearing down of rocks elsewhere. In some places, you can find layers of small pebbles in these rocks. These are due to slightly swifter currents, which were able to move larger fragments. You will note that all the pebbles are very well rounded. This generally indicates that they have been carried quite a long way in running water. During this transportation, the edges and corners have been knocked off or ground off. Sometimes, by studying the pebbles in such layers, geologists are able to tell a great deal about the kind of rock that was being torn away and the kind of terrain it came from. Layers in the rock. The layers which are visible in the rocks result from the way the sediments were laid down long ago. Sands and silts were being spread out on the deltas of rivers or in shallow marine areas near shore. As each storm or each flood brought in surges of water, new layers of sand and silt, or even pebbles, were laid down. During quieter times, finer particles were added to the accumulating sediments. Then the next interruption in the process brought the next change in the kind of deposit, producing still more layers. Figure 2. Erosion of the cliffs of sedimentary rocks and the overlying blanket of glacial till produces reddish pebbles and sands nearby. Here, the sorting action of the waves has produced zones of different composition parallel to the waterline. The layering in the rocks on the north shore of Prince Edward Island is very nearly flat, which shows that these rocks have not been disturbed by the great forces in the outer part of the earth which have so folded and twisted the rocks in many other parts of the maritime provinces. Some layers, small in area, can be seen to dip at 20 degrees or so away from the horizon. These are only local variations due to currents pushing sediment over the edge of growing deltas, or perhaps even to local scouring and filling at the time of origin. Something else you may note about the layering is the way the flat pieces of debris lie parallel to the bedding or layering. If the rock were being laid down in water, then flat particles would be expected to lie flat rather than to stand on edge. If you will look at the rocks along the shore, you will see over and over again that this is the case. Flat fragments of shiny white mica or flattened pebbles lie along the bedding planes or layering. One has only to go to the seashore now and watch the waves moving the sand grains to see how this is brought about. Joints in the rock. The rock is conspicuously broken by parallel splits, which are more or less vertical, in several places along the shore. These are best observed about a mile north of Rustico Breakwater. The breaks or joints in the rock are little more than hairline fractures, but they are open enough to allow a little water to trickle down into the rock. In some of these joints, small amounts of whitish mineral material, commonly lime or calcium carbonate, are deposited by such trickling water, and it becomes clearly visible when the joints are laid bare by erosion. Erosion of the rock. All over the world, waves gradually wear away rocky coasts. They do this by dissolving the materials that cement the particles together, by grinding loose grains of sand and pebbles against the solid rock, and by the sheer pressure of the moving water itself. Areas where the rock is slightly softer or less resistant are worn away faster. On one part of the shore, the rocks may have more joints. Another part may be made of more porous or less tightly cemented rock. Or perhaps there may be slight variations in the relative amounts of mud, sand, or silt. Any of these can make a difference in the resistance to erosion. Figure 3. The red rocks that underlie all of Prince Edward Island have been eroded by streams, waves, and ancient glaciers to produce the soils, the overburden of clay, sand, and gravel, and the sands on the beaches. Here, just east of the end of Cavendish Beach, Here, just east of the end of Cavendish Beach, erosion has left a sea stack standing alone offshore and irregular cliffs of rock. The overburden of glacial debris can be seen on top of the rocks of the point, as can the thin dark line of the soil and grassy vegetation on the very top. Rocky coasts are often undercut by the waves to produce overhanging cliffs. If the water eats into the rock on each side of a point, a hole may be cut right through, so that a tunnel or archway is formed. It frequently happens that as the shoreline recedes, erosion leaves behind small isolated remnants of former cliffs. These become small islands or stacks, like the one just east of the east end of Cavendish Beach.